Some people just can't take a joke. Why is everyone so sensitive these days? Comedy is about triggering the libs. The more political it is, the funnier it gets. And if you're not laughing, you're part of the problem that we're having right now in America. Every month, the woke agenda claims a new victim. And this month, it's Dave Chappelle. Yet again. In the past, Dave Chappelle has come under fire for his comments about transgender individuals, who have in turn rallied against the company that has produced his most recent comedy specials, Netflix. Despite being canceled by the woke mob, the company continues to pay him upwards of $20 million per special to say what no one is allowed to say these days. That trans people are gross, yucky, weird bullies who are weird and probably shouldn't stand up for themselves if they want people to be nice to them. In his new special, The Dreamer, he pushes the envelope yet again by refusing to back away from the subject. And naturally, people wanted to know what I had to say about it. So we're here yet again to talk about my favorite comedian. Now, if you're new to my YouTube channel, hi, my name is katblaque, and I like to think that I make content for introspective hot people. And if you're here, I'll assume that's you. If you couldn't tell, I was being a little sarcastic at the very beginning of this video, but I'm not being sarcastic when I say that Dave Chappelle is one of my favorite comedians. Now, I don't have the fangirl gene, so it's not like I obsess over him or anything. I really only obsess over one man in my house, honestly. But historically, I have enjoyed quite a bit of Dave Chappelle's comedy. Now, I did not grow up with cable, which is probably why I turned out how I did, but anytime I had the opportunity to gain access to Comedy Central, I made a point of watching the Dave Chappelle show because unlike things like SNL, I always knew that the Dave Chappelle show was gonna be funny. In fact, I think the Dave Chappelle show was probably my very first example of a TV show that was produced by a Black person that spoke about tough subjects like racism in a comedic way. And I'm not gonna ignore that that probably was really influential to my own life and my own creations on YouTube. So I know that I like the Dave Chappelle show, but I actually haven't seen a lot of his stand-up comedy until his recent Netflix specials. And let me just tell ya, them's is two very different Dave Chappelles. As a transgender woman who makes media commentary videos, a lot of people ask me what my feelings were about his previous special, The Closer, and I actually sat down and filmed myself watching the entire show and made commentary as the show went on. And part of why I filmed myself watching the entire series is because at the time, a lot of the reactions to people criticizing The Closer was that people were taking Dave Chappelle's comments out of context. And to be fair, a lot of people were. So I wanted to sit down and actually demonstrate that I was giving Dave Chappelle a fair shot. I also sort of wanted to demonstrate that I was not a person who just hated Dave Chappelle or didn't find any of his jokes funny. No, I have enjoyed a lot of Dave Chappelle's comedy. And to me, it being offensive was never really an issue. I am a weirdo. So I think offensive comedy is really up my alley, but for me, it can't just be offensive. It has to also be funny. And if you want to know what my feelings were about his previous special, I will leave a link in the description box below and also in the cards. Sitting down to make this video, I was very tempted to do the thing that I did before, watch the entire thing live and give my commentary as it went on. But honestly, at this point, I found myself asking a very different question. Ever since I've moved to Los Angeles, I make a point of going to see live comedy at least once a month. You can catch me at a shitty dive bar comedy show somewhere in the city because I personally really enjoy listening to comedians bomb. Now, before you judge me, one of the reasons why I like to go to those shows is because as a public speaker, there is something that feels very human about it. A shitty dive bar comedy show is usually the type of show where comedians are still working on their jokes. And for me, there is something really beautiful about participating in a space where the people who are storytellers are still trying to figure out the best way to tell the stories. These are not comedians who are set in their ways. These are comedians who are still honing their craft, and there's something really beautiful about seeing them do that live in front of you. They're throwing a bunch of stuff out there to see what lands, and sometimes it doesn't land at all. As they start to lose the audience, an excellent comedian can usually save their set by shifting the direction of their set or telling a new joke. And sometimes the best course of action is ending the set on a good note so they can savor the laughs that they did get. But some comedians will make the fact that their joke isn't landing the audience's fault. And we saw a really good example of that with how Joe Coy bombed at the Golden Globes.
Or what casting directors call character actor. Some I wrote, some other people wrote. Robert De Niro's here. Yo, I got the gig 10 days ago. You want a perfect monologue? Yo, shut up. You're kidding me, right? Slow down. I wrote some of these, and they're the ones you're laughing at. Look.
And sometimes comedians will lean into this idea that the audience is just too sensitive to handle the really offensive joke that they really want to tell. We saw that with Joe Coy's terrible Barbie joke.
Oppenheimer is based on a 721-page Pulitzer Prize-winning book about the Manhattan Project. And Barbie is on a plastic doll with big boobies. I watched Barbie. I loved it. I really did love it. I don't want you guys to think that I'm a creep, but it was kind of weird being attracted to a plastic doll.
He was running out of material, so he reached for misogyny, this commonly understood, historically backed bias against women, and the subsequent objectification that comes along with it. The joke is literally, ha ha ha, Barbie is a woman, woman have boob, boob is funny, boob, 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 ha ha ha, not as good as nuclear holocaust. It's just hacky. And honestly, that is exactly how I feel when I listen to Dave Chappelle's trans jokes. But his comedy hasn't always felt that way to me. So the question I had going into this video was, has Dave Chappelle always been like this and I just didn't notice? Or is he starting to lose his touch?
I mean, I left DC in the 80s. It was not like this in the 80s. When crack was going on. Remember when crack was going on? White people be looking at DC from Virginia with binoculars and shit. Well, that looks dangerous.
As I said, I am mostly familiar with the Dave Chappelle show, so I wanted to go back and try to watch his comedy special from 24 years ago called Killing Them Softly so that I could compare and contrast it with The Dreamer. Now, I have never seen Killing Them Softly, so this was my very first viewing ever, and I have to say that I was pleasantly surprised. I really enjoyed Killing Them Softly. It is just engaging from very beginning to very, very end, and seeing that, I understand why so many people love Dave Chappelle's stand-up comedy, because in Killing Them Softly, he really does a great job of keeping the audience engaged. It is a completely tight set from beginning to end, and are there offensive jokes? Yeah, but I laughed at most of them.
She wanted to fuck a powerful man, period. That's as far as she thought it through. She wasn't thinking about how powerful the president was. She didn't have no wisdom. An older woman would have helped everybody. An older woman would have been in there, you should lower taxes. You know what I'm saying? The older one would have sucked us into utopia.
Now, I could be alone in this, but personally, when I go to comedy shows, I go to laugh. I don't go to specifically listen to the comedian lambast a specific group of people. In my last video about Dave Chappelle, I had a lot of comments from people who were saying that one of the main reasons why they like Dave Chappelle is that he makes fun of everyone. And I honestly gotta call bullshit on that. Like, I'm not saying that it's impossible, but I'm pretty sure that the white people who go to Dave Chappelle shows don't go to Dave Chappelle shows because they really like hearing him tell jokes about how silly white people are. I doubt it. It's not impossible. I'm a white ally, so, y'all will have to tell me if that is part of what you do. But I doubt it. I think the reason you like Dave Chappelle is because you think he's funny. Whenever we have conversations about offensive comedy, we often hear this mantra of nothing should ever be off the table when it comes to comedy. And in a lot of ways, I tend to agree with that. I think a good comedian can make jokes about everything. Like I said, I go to a lot of comedy shows, and I usually go with my partner, who is a very tall, very white, bald man. And these comedy shows tend to be really intimate, which means that if there is any sort of crowd work being done by any of the comedians that go on stage, there is a very high likelihood that we will be focused on. So I think for me, learning to laugh at yourself is sort of part of the in-person comedy experience. As a professional joke and disappointment to my father, I definitely have learned to laugh at myself, and I think it keeps me humble, and it's one of the things that makes me a well-rounded person. A lot of times in these conversations around Dave Chappelle, we always talk about learning to laugh at yourself. And I think that that is a really interesting thing when it comes to Dave Chappelle, because Dave Chappelle definitely has a sizable white audience. Killing Them Softly was filmed in Washington, D.C., actually at the same exact theater that The Dreamer was filmed in. And Washington, D.C., I didn't know this until I actually went to Washington, D.C., is very Black historically. I mean, it is called Chocolate City. And one of the main things that he focuses on at the very beginning of his set is the racial tensions between white and Black folks. One of the jokes that he tells that made me kind of laugh is about how if you are a group of Black friends, you should have at least one white friend in order to make it easier for the police to interact with you. And I think that's funny to a lot of white people because they know and understand that the police see Black people and white people very differently and police Black people and white people very differently. So they know what he's saying is based in some degree of truth. And that's why I think his white audience is able to laugh at themselves. Now, I'm not going to act like comedians should be educators, philosophers, and soothsayers, but that's how many treat Dave Chappelle. His fans' reaction to criticisms of his jokes has largely been that Dave Chappelle is right and that everyone should get over it and learn how to take a joke. And honestly, I think that when a comedian makes his set mostly about making a grand political statement, the comedy comes second to that. The noticeable difference between Killing Them Softly and The Dreamer is that with age, Dave Chappelle has become kind of preachy. In Killing Them Softly, Dave Chappelle is still a young man honing his craft with a lot to prove. But The Dreamer is self-indulgent. It's self-congratulatory. It ends with a sermon, and by the end of that sermon, you're supposed to walk away with the impression that Dave Chappelle is not just a great comedian, but a great mind. A man who is justifiably right and has earned the right to say so. In my opinion, regardless of what you're advocating for, whether you're on the right or the left, when your comedy set becomes primarily about how right you are about a certain political stance, that just doesn't tend to be funny in the way that we want a comedian to be funny. The Daily Wire recently released a film called Lady Ballers, and this film is about a group of failed male athletes who decide to join a women's league and dominate the competition. Basically done in the style of like an Adam Sandler film that would have come out in the 2000s. The Daily Wire is a conservative media company owned by Ben Shapiro, and recently they put a lot of resources forward to produce some conservative TV shows and movies. Now, to me, there's a pretty big difference between a conservative comedian and conservative comedy. For example, Roseanne Barr used to be a pretty funny conservative comedian, and now she mostly produces conservative comedy, which is really just her getting on the stage and voicing her political views in a silly voice in anticipation for applause. And that's basically what Lady Ballers is. I was watching this podcast called The Downside, which is hosted by two comedians, and they actually watched Lady Ballers to analyze its conservative comedy. Now, the Daily Wire billed Lady Ballers as the most triggering comedy of the decade. So these two comedians went and watched the movie to sort of see if it was truly the most triggering of the decade. Spoiler alert, it was not the most triggering comedy of the decade. In fact, it only had a TV 14 rating, and they found that the comedy overall was actually quite sophomoric.
If your comedy has a thesis, make it a paper, because it's not a comedy.
Yeah. And it already is. They already have that. They already have
that
their
in a million
shows.
different ways.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to watch a movie where the whole comedy, the whole point is like people against gay marriage are stupid, because that's just a fact. And again, that's me making a point. That's not funny. It's just not funny. What these people don't understand is it's not just the thing they're trying to poke fun at. It's that they are bad at it. And what they're mad is people aren't laughing at their bad attempt. South Park all the time does this stuff, and partly it's funny because they don't have a strict agenda. They really are more equal opportunity offenders, and it's funny. So another point, this happens twice, and you saw the first one. This cast, as you might have guessed, is very white. And really, maybe there's a couple times I missed. The only time Black people are used are to make a very old hacky race joke. Mm-hmm. They're on the basketball team, the opposing team. Now they're using quote unquote trans women, and it's just all Black players, signifying that now they're going to get destroyed. And then one of them gets the shorts pulled down, and someone gets the line that I know when they came up with this line, they said, that's going to be the funniest part of the movie. And the line is, that's the biggest dick I've ever seen on a woman in my life. And I know that when they shot that, they had to do it 10 times because Ben Shapiro kept nutting in his pants. He was laughing so hard. I know they thought this was the greatest comedic moment of all time. A Black guy that has a big penis, and it was playing women's sports. And they said, this is the height of comedy. But that's my point. It's not. It is the basic thought. It is the first impulse that you grow out of. For a fifth grader, yeah, it is funny. When you're in second grade, doing an accent might be the funniest thing in the world, but you grow and you ultimately learn anyone can do that. Anyone can go, he's got a big dick.
Yeah.
That's not worthy of a film crew.
Yeah.
Now, I'm no comedian, but these guys are. And if you are really curious what actual comedians have to say about Lady Ballers, I definitely would check out that episode. I will link it in the description box below. What got me about Lady Ballers is the people who produced it are genuinely under the impression that what they're saying is bold and brave and edgy. But in all reality, they're actually reflecting the status quo feeling that many have about transgender women participating in sports. It's something that most people are uncomfortable with. Now, I know that there's a lot of people who have really strong feelings about transgender women in sports, and we are not really necessarily here to debate that particular topic. But whether you agree or disagree, I think it's really important to point out that the hypothetical that Lady Ballers poses is actually not a thing. It's not how it works. Men are not just identifying as women and being accepted on women's teams. In fact, Ben Shapiro actually wanted to make Lady Ballers a documentary, but the problem they ran into is that in order for these men to join a woman's team, they had to undergo hormone replacement therapy, which of course none of them wanted to do.
You approached me and you said we should make a fictional film about this topic. Now, to be fair, I think I'd actually suggested to the Crane Boys that they do this as a doc.
Yes.
I originally went to them and I said, you guys should go try out for a bunch of ladies' leagues. And that became not possible because, as it turns out, most ladies' leagues don't allow in actual men. And they weren't willing to go the full distance in terms of what it would require in order to, the actual hormone treatments and everything.
So the main joke that Lady Ballers is making is completely based on a false premise. And it's a joke that really only lands if you are completely ignorant about what transgender athletes are up against. And as somebody who has been on hormones for almost 2 decades, I definitely understand why these athletic men probably didn't want to take hormones. Hormones dramatically decreases your muscle mass. It makes it way easier for you to gain weight, and it makes it really, really hard for you to lose weight. Hormones very severely impact the way that your body functions, which is why one of the requirements for the leagues that allow transgender women to participate is that they are on hormones for X amount of time. And contrary to popular belief, hormones are not handed out like candy. In some states, you have to go through a series of therapy visits before you're even allowed to do hormone replacement therapy. And in other places, when you do get to the point where you can actually start doing HRT and you can see an endocrinologist, it sometimes means that you're going to have to wait on a waiting list. And that waiting list sometimes takes months. For some people, it can take years. It is not actually easy to gain access to gender affirming care in the vast majority of places in this country. And no matter how true it is that getting on HRT is hard and transgender athletes do not have an easy time joining these leagues, there are people who look at something like Lady Ballers as essentially a documentary that depicts a real thing that is happening. Dave Chappelle's jokes about race relations land because he's speaking from his experience as a Black man who has had to actually navigate through these things. On the flip side, his jokes about transgender people in The Dreamer only land with his audience because he is speaking to and capitalizing on the ignorance that his audience has about transgender people's experiences. Because so many people are ignorant about transgender people's experiences, I completely understand why plenty of people who follow Dave Chappelle and love what he's doing laugh at these jokes. But as a transgender woman who lives this life and has these experiences, it's hard for me to find the humor in what he's saying because I know what's true. And I know that a lot of his jokes are based on a false premise. For example, in The Dreamer, he tells a joke about going to prison and how before he's sent off to prison, he's going to tell the judge that he actually identifies as a woman so that he gets put into women's prison instead of men's prison. In reality, at least in this country, if he wanted to get sent away to women's prison, he would have to undergo a full sex change operation. And this usually requires years of hormone replacement therapy, doctor's meetings, therapist letters, and it's a very, very expensive surgery. The surgery can cost upwards of $60,000, and that's on the low end, and you probably don't want a cheap designer pussy, so you're probably going to end up spending upwards of $100,000, and that's the first surgery, not including the often inevitable revision surgery. Transgender women who want bottom surgery have to go down a long and extensive path to get there. There are so many considerations to make. There's different types of surgeries, and it's something that people consider very heavily because you have to live with it for the rest of your life. It's not a surgery that people do lightly. In one of his specials, he makes a joke about a transgender woman throwing her dismembered penis on the table. And that joke is hilarious if your understanding of bottom surgery is that transgender women cut their dicks off. And that's not how that surgery works. It's not cut off, it's repurposed. And usually what you have before dramatically impacts what you get after. Dave Chappelle describes transgender people as immensely privileged, but the reality for most transgender people is that because they are transgender, they often struggle to financially support themselves in a society that is still struggling to accept transgender people. So the reality is that surgery isn't accessible to most transgender women who live in a society that still very much does judge transgender people. Maybe to very, very privileged people, but most trans women are not Caitlyn Jenner. So the vast majority of transgender women will never have this surgery, and not all trans women do. But most people are not going to care enough about transgender people to be informed about what they actually go through. And most people are only familiar with transgender people in the context of ridicule. So again, that's why a lot of people find these jokes to be funny, because they often don't know enough about transgender people to know that they're not really reflective of actual transgender people's lives. Now, I am more than aware of the fact that these jokes are not meant to be taken literally, but I felt like sharing all of that because I'm still stuck on the premise not being truthful. And that's why these jokes aren't funny to me. These jokes are just reflective of the ignorance that cis people have about what transgender people really experience. I hear them the way that I hear Joe Coy's Barbie joke. Ha ha ha, boobs are funny and weird. Ha ha ha, Barbie is a woman. That is the way that I interpret it because I know better. And I think it's disappointing because I think that Dave is actually clever enough to actually make a good trans joke. But it is so much easier to be ignorant and to play to the ignorance of your audience. I typically would not put him in the same category as a Joe Coy or a shitty conservative movie like Lady Ballers, but that's where he sits for me right now. And watching Killing Them Softly really just brought home for me that Dave Chappelle is just not on that level anymore. You know, the paradox that drives me insane in this conversation is that I get offended when people think that I'm offended by Dave Chappelle's jokes, because I'm not offended by his jokes. I think his jokes are stupid. Constantly being told by Dave Chappelle's fans to get thicker skin and learn how to take a joke is really annoying to me, because part of me being a transgender woman is having thick skin. I could not survive in this world without having thick skin. I could not survive by accepting other people's negative feelings about me being transgender. I transitioned completely alone with no support from anyone during a time where there were no employment protections for transgender people. I could not survive in this world if I allowed people's feelings about my gender to limit my mobility in this world. And part of that was accepting that not everyone's going to like it. Throughout my life, I have had to endure ire and rejection because of who I am, because of what I am. And through it all, I have refused to see myself as a victim. I have learned to accept that I will be ridiculed for deviating from the norm. And that's why I find it to be so annoying when people who cling to the norm, who cling to the status quo, have somehow convinced themselves that they're stronger and braver than I'll ever be. Newsflash, rejection of transgender people is the status quo. And in this status quo, transgender people are often never viewed as the faithful narrators of their own experiences. And for me, that is the actual issue that I have with the way that Dave Chappelle is positioned in the ongoing discourse about transgender people's lives. If you're not transgender and you've watched this video up to this point and you've heard everything that I have to say, even if you walk away from this video disagreeing with me, I want to thank you from the very bottom of my heart for taking the time to hear what I have to say, because you're doing something that a lot of people seem uncomfortable doing. The uphill battle that many transgender people are constantly fighting against is that most people seem more interested in hearing what a person who is not transgender has to say about being transgender than they do hearing from a transgender person speaking about their own life and experiences. And the frustrating part of this is no matter how wrong they are or how ignorant they may be, their idea, their hypothetical, their assumption is often viewed with far more validity than just us speaking about our own life and experiences. And very commonly, whenever transgender people try to stand up for themselves, we are told to shut up, get over it, grow thicker skin. And it's frustrating because we live in a society where the ignorance about our lives is defining what we can and can't do in this society. So many people would rather engage with a hypothetical about a transgender person than they would actually listen to a transgender person speak about their own feelings and how they navigate through this society. And for me, that is the most frustrating thing about the discourse around Dave Chappelle. In reality, Dave Chappelle did not need to make any jokes about transgender people. But when he did, he presented the idea that they are highly privileged people who mutilate their bodies, who are willing to bully someone to the point of ending their own life. And when he said those things, it was part of a joke, but these were supposed to be actual, realistic descriptions of how transgender people are. And again, when people criticized these jokes, it wasn't, oh, it's just a joke, he's not serious. It's that he was correct for what he said, and the things he's saying are true. And he fed this to his already ignorant audience during a time where hundreds of anti-LGBT bills are popping up across the country. Now, is Dave Chappelle solely responsible for the spread of anti-LGBT sentiment across the country? No, obviously not. But he certainly did decide to pour gasoline on that fire and then identify with the gasoline so that anyone who tries to throw water on it couldn't do so without feeding his flame. For some people, the more criticism Dave Chappelle receives, the more proof of how right he is. But I'm stuck on the fact that all that aside, he's just not as funny as he used to be. And personally, I think his trans jokes are just an indication of just how much of a hack he has become. And honestly, I'm pretty disappointed by that because I think he's actually a much better comedian. The Dreamer is very obviously a comedy special for a comedian who feels like they have done enough, who feels like he doesn't need to do the thing that comedians do. Dave Chappelle just is funny. And I think in so many ways, there's plenty of things to prove that, right? He has worked for a very long time, produced a lot of stuff, given me many laughs over the years. And I think he has, in so many ways, earned his right to be that guy who says, I'm funny, just accept it, whatever. But it's honestly just, again, disappointing. He very obviously is writing for applause, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. I can guarantee you that the next Netflix special he puts out, there will be a slew of trans jokes and then jokes about how people have canceled him, referencing how he can't say certain things these days. And I guess for me, it's just getting kind of repetitive. I thought that The Dreamer was definitely a funnier comedy special than his last comedy special, but I think you're lying if you think it's funnier than Killing Them Softly. And I guess it's interesting for me because as an artist and a public speaker, one of the things that I really appreciate is looking back at what I've done before and say, oh my gosh, you're so much better than that now. And I just don't think that Dave Chappelle can honestly do that when it comes to his work. I think that you're lying if you think that The Dreamer is a better special than Killing Them Softly. And clearly Dave Chappelle has nothing to prove to anyone. Like I said, to me, a good comedian knows when to end their set and to savor the laughter that they did receive. And I know that there will always be people who eat up every single comedy special that he puts out. And I think for that reason, he's gonna be stuck in his ways for quite some time. But I, for one, wish that he would heed the 5-minute warning from the stage manager, wrap it up, and leave the stage. So that's what I had to say about Dave Chappelle's newest comedy special, The Dreamer. Let me know what you guys felt about The Dreamer. Did you think it was better than Killing Them Softly? If so, I think you and I are gonna have to tussle because I think Killing Them Softly is the superior one, but also because I haven't seen all of his comedy specials, I don't actually know if that's his best one. So my question for you, if you are a Dave Chappelle fan, is what do you think is his best comedy special and why? I would love to know your answer in the comment box below, so I'm looking forward to reading the comments on this video. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting my work on Patreon. Recently, I released the Seedling tier on my Patreon where I post audio-only versions of my videos before they go live, so that will actually be, if you want to be early, that'll actually be the way to be early. So if you're interested in that, check out my Patreon where I also upload a bunch of private vlogs about my personal life and all of the thoughts behind what I do on my YouTube channel. Also, right now, I am working on my series Movies in My Closet, which is a queer retrospective of films that I saw when I was in the closet way back when. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, also consider supporting me on Patreon because right now, especially, that's going to help me quite a bit. Anyway, on that note, I'll talk to you guys next time, and I want you to always remember and to never forget that you are beautiful and you are loved. Bye. It sounds so strange when I don't have nails. Next time you guys see me, I will have nails. I'm dying over here. Bye.